Welcome to Torah Today Ministries and our continuing series called Parshah Seasonings, where we look at some of the oddities that are sometimes found in the Hebrew of the Scriptures and also in the Torah scroll itself. And in this episode, we are in episode Vaera, which is the second portion of Exodus, and it begins in chapter 6, verse 2, and continues through chapter 9, verse 35. So let's look at those first two verses. And this is what it says. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Adonai. Now, whenever I use the term Adonai here, it's a reference to Yud He Vav He. So, for whatever reasons, I spelled it out Adonai in the first occurrence, and I spelled it out in Hebrew Yud He Vav He in the second, but they're the same. I am Adonai, and I appeared, that's Vaera, the name of our portion. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yud He Vav He, or we say Adonai, I did not make myself known to them. Now, what's so very odd about this are a few things. First of all, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did know God's name spelled Yud He Vav He. They knew it, and they used it often. In fact, we even find it revealed to Adam himself. So what is going on here that God says, I did not make myself known to them by the name Yud He Vav He? Well, if we understand how in Jewish culture, in fact, in Middle Eastern culture as a whole, how names are used and what names mean, it makes more sense. Here in the West, a name is just a label that you can put on a name tag on your shirt. But in the Middle East and in Jewish culture and biblical culture, a name is a person's essence. So you could know a person's name and how it's spelled. Like if someone sends me a letter, they can tell me their name, but if I don't know the person, I don't know the essence of that person. So God is saying they may have known the title, the four-letter title. But now I'm going to reveal the person, the God behind that title. Now what's interesting, he says they knew me by El Shaddai, and El Shaddai means the all-powerful or the provider. And as one rabbi put it, El Shaddai is God's name in space, in place. But Yud He Vav He is his name in time, because he says Yud He Vav He is his memorial name forever. And it is derived from I am that I am. So it's his name in time for eternity. But El Shaddai is about how he provides here in this world to us and provides all of our needs in place. So space and time, El Shaddai, Yud He Vav He. Now, the reason I'm pointing out in the red, and I appeared, Vaera, is because there's something very interesting about this. Now, God says here he appeared to Abraham and to his son Isaac and Isaac's son Jacob as El Shaddai. But that word Vaera also plays an interesting role in God's relationship with these three men. What we discover is this word Vaera appears three times in the story of Abraham, because three times God appeared, Vaera, to Abraham. And I put the references here, Genesis 12:7, 17:1, and 18:1. But it's only used twice in the story of Isaac. It's in Genesis 26:2, and then again in verse 24. And in Jacob, the word Vaera is used only one time of God revealing himself and appearing to Jacob, and that's in Genesis 35:9. So it's three times with Abraham, twice with Isaac, once with Jacob. And this has to make you wonder, because there's nothing coincidental, there's nothing by accident or happenstance in the Torah. Every jot, every tittle, every word is placed by God exactly where it's supposed to be. So if God saw fit for this word to be used three times in his relationship with Abraham, twice in his relationship with Isaac, and once in his relationship with Jacob, there's something to learn here. I'm not sure quite what it is, but I have a theory, and you may come up with a theory of your own. I'd love to hear what it is. Please email me, leave a comment. But I look at it this way. Abraham did not have anyone to teach him about God, El Shaddai or Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. What he learned about God, he basically learned through his own experiences with God. So 3 times, Vaera, and he appeared, God did to Abraham. But Isaac had an advantage. He had a relationship with Abraham. He learned from Abraham what Abraham had learned about God. And so with Isaac, Vaera appears only 2 times. And then with Jacob, Jacob had a double advantage. As a young man, he would sit and learn from his grandfather Abraham. He would learn from his father Isaac. And then God also, Vaera, and he appeared to Jacob. If this theory of mine is what lies behind this diminishing number of uses of God appearing to these patriarchs, it means that we are required to learn from those who know God. God can appear, God can speak, God can do whatever God wants to do. He is God, and we can't make rules governing when he appears or when he speaks or how he does it. But I believe that this diminishing use of Vaera is a way of him teaching us the principle that he wants us to listen to our elders. He wants us to learn from those who've gone before us and to learn from their experiences. And also, the older should be teaching and passing on to the younger the things that they're learning, the things that they've experienced with God. And God has entrusted with us this amazing, incredible benefit and honor of passing on his truth and our relationship with him and sharing it with others. And we need to do that. So that's my theory. And again, I'd like to hear from you what yours might be. Well, let's continue on in the same chapter down to verse 9. It says here, Moses spoke thus to the people of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses. And a lot of times we find people not listening to God even today. And here's one of the reasons why people are unable to hear. It says, because of their shortness of breath and hard work. You know, the enemy likes to put more and more and more work on us. And what does Messiah say? Come to me, come learn of me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light, and we'll find rest to our souls. And when we look at the relationship of Israel under Pharaoh and how he kept making their burdens heavier and more difficult, when they come to God, he makes their burden very easy and very light. We'll be seeing that as we go through. But this word for breath is the word ruach in Hebrew. And ruach is the word that also means spirit. Holy Spirit is ruach hakodesh. So we could also put down here because of their shortness of spirit and hard work. And again, you always have to look at the context to determine which word is meant. And in this context, I think both can apply. But it makes me think of the Beatitudes and what Yeshua says in Matthew 5:3. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." So let's do with the Beatitude the reverse of what we did here. Here it says short of breath, but could be short of spirit. And here in the Beatitudes, Yeshua says, those who are poor in spirit or short of spirit, we could say, he's saying, blessed are those who are short of breath. Those who are just worn out. And so it's something to think about. But I think that when Yeshua referred to this and used this phrase, poor in spirit, he may very well have had in mind Exodus 6:9. As we move on, we continue in chapter 6, and we come to verse 27, which is a very odd verse in the Hebrew. Now, the rabbis are constantly commenting on this and have done over the centuries, but if you're only using an English translation, you will not be able to discover this. It's very unlikely your translation points this out. Here's what the verse says. They, referring to Moses and Aaron, were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing out the people of Israel from Egypt. He was Moses and Aaron. Now the word they is used at the beginning of the verse, which is the word hem, which means they, referring, it's male. But instead of saying they were Moses and Aaron, as your English translation will, it's actually the singular, he, which is the word who in Hebrew. He was Moses and Aaron. Now most people look at this and say, well, that's bad grammar, whether it's in English or in Hebrew. But bad grammar or not, it's not a mistake. It's the way the Torah was written. It was written purposefully, and it's been that way from day one. What is God trying to teach us through this? He was Moses and Aaron. Well, there's something very interesting. If you think about the story of Moses and Aaron that appeared in last week's Torah portion, we find that God called Moses and commissioned him to go to Egypt to tell Pharaoh, let my people go, and he gave him the signs to perform. And there was no word to Moses about taking his brother along with him. From what we read about God saying to Moses, Moses, I want you to go. I want you to go alone. I want you to do this. But Moses made excuses. He hemmed and hawed. And after his 4 excuses, he flatly says outright, send somebody else. And then God got angry. He says, well, your brother Aaron's coming out to meet you. I know he can talk good. And I'll make him your prophet. And oh my goodness, when you look over the life of Aaron, who was a good man, a holy man, you see him making some mistakes that probably wouldn't have been made if Moses had followed through right from the beginning. So it's almost as if God's original intention was just for Moses to go, just he by himself. But since Aaron is now included, God treats them almost as one. I believe this is why when you see Aaron committing errors, he's never punished for them, because it's really Moses' fault that Aaron was in the position he was to start with. I'm thinking of the episode of the golden calf that we'll come to later here in Exodus. Well, Moses up on the mountain, Aaron's the one who builds the golden calf. Now, it wasn't his idea, but he's not the one who instigated the thing, but the people looked to him as their leader, and so he built this golden calf. And people died. Many died because of this terrible sin. But Aaron gets off scot-free. Nothing happens to him. Even though it says over in Deuteronomy, it's in Deuteronomy chapter 20, I believe, chapter 9, verse 20, God says, I was so angry with Aaron, I wanted to destroy him. But no punishment comes Aaron's way. Then later, Aaron and his sister Miriam, they begin to gossip and complain about Moses, and God strikes Miriam with leprosy. Why didn't Aaron get struck with leprosy? He gets off scot-free again. And again, it's a theory of mine, but it's almost as if because it was originally God's idea that Moses go along, and since Moses is the one who really balked at this, God brought Aaron into his life and said, okay, we'll let Aaron be your mouthpiece. And so when Aaron errs, it's not put at Aaron's account because he wasn't supposed to be there. And maybe that's what's being hinted at here when it says he was Moses and Aaron. Just a thought, a theory. Give me your theory. Okay, let's continue on to the next chapter. Chapter 7, verse 12. Now, I've mentioned before in other teachings how before the internet came along and we had hyperlinks, the scriptures had beat that by several thousand years because we find hyperlinks in the original Hebrew. In other words, you find a word, a phrase, a particular situation here that parallels something that takes place in another part of the Bible altogether that maybe have happened centuries later. And here's several. There are several here in this Torah portion. Here's the first one. Exodus 7:12. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. This, of course, is the showdown in Pharaoh's palace when Moses' staff became a serpent, and then the magicians of Egypt they threw down their staffs. They became serpents, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. The phrase their staffs is one word in Hebrew. It's the word matotam. Matah is the word for staff, and we saw that at the burning bush when Moses threw his staff and it became a serpent. And matot is the plural. Mototam means their staffs. That word, matotam, is found two places and two places only in the Bible. This is the first occurrence. So let's follow the hyperlink to the other occurrence. The other occurrence is in the book of Numbers, chapter 17, verse 6. Now, a little background here. This is part of the rebellion of the people. We find several rebellious episodes in a row here in this section of Numbers. And it started with Korah. Remember Korah's rebellion? And the earth opened up and swallowed up Korah and his group of men, of rebels. And then there is an outbreak of fire as the people complained. And anyways, finally, they're questioning Aaron's position, like it seemed I was doing a moment ago, but not really. And so Moses had them all bring their staffs. They put their names on their staffs, and they put them before the ark in the tabernacle. In the morning, Aaron's staff was budding with almond blossoms and ripe almonds. So the verse, Numbers 17:6, says, Moses spoke to the people of Israel, and all their chiefs gave him staffs, one for each chief from each tribe, according to their fathers' houses, 12 staffs, and the staff of Aaron was among matatot, their staffs. There's the only other place where this word appears. Now, let's compare these. On the one hand, we've got Egyptian occult magicians who are practicing their witchcraft, their dark arts to turn their staffs into serpents. But over here, we've got leaders of the tribes of Israel and their staffs. What's the connection? And I think it is this. We're all familiar with that verse in 1 Samuel 15:23, where Samuel says, for rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft or divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. So in Exodus, we see witchcraft being practiced. But here in Numbers, even though these were supposedly godly, Torah-following men, we find rebellion. And I think this hyperlink is saying what they did is somehow as bad or worse than what these Egyptians did. Remember, all you have to do to act like Satan is to do what's right in your own eyes, because that's what he did. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. It's as the sin of Satan worship, because remember, Satan's not interested in getting you to do Satan's will. Satan is only interested in getting you to do yours. Because when you do your will instead of God's, you're behaving like Satan, the original rebel who did his will instead of God's. Thus the hyperlink between the occultists of Egypt and the rebels in Israel. Let's continue on. In chapter 8, verse 14, here's another hyperlink. The plagues have begun. The second plague, the plague of frogs, we know about that. And once the plague was over, there were probably millions of frogs rotting, and they heaped them into piles and set them afire. And it says there in verse 14, now you'll notice here in brackets I have 10. This is one of those places, or a few, in the Torah where the verse numbers in the English and the verse numbers in the Hebrew are off. So it's off by 4 verses. So in your English Bibles, it's going to be verse 14. If you're looking at a Hebrew Bible, it will be verse 10. Same verse, just a different number. And it says, and they heaped them together in piles, and the land stank. Can you imagine? The phrase "and they heaped" is one word. It's the word vayitzberu. Vayitzberu, it occurs 2 times in the entire Bible. Now, this is the second occurrence of this word vayitzberu. The first occurrence is in Genesis 41:35. This is in the days of Joseph, when he was the monarch, you could say, of Egypt under the Pharaoh, but Joseph was kind of running the show. And it says, "And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and heap up," vayitzberu, "grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it." Wow, what a difference. You know, we have the Pharaoh who honored Joseph and allowed him to basically run the country, and all the blessing that came. And people from the surrounding nations came to Egypt to get food because Joseph became the life giver. So when you have a Pharaoh like that Pharaoh, then a Joseph can provide food that will feed the world. But then at the opening of Exodus, we read about a Pharaoh that arose that did not know Joseph. Instead of heaping up grain, they're heaping up stinky dead frogs. What a contrast. What a striking contrast. And so we want to make sure that we have the right authority in our lives, that we are serving the right authority, and that we are being the right authority over the situations God gives us to be an authority over. You know, I want there to be food and grain, not to be stinky dead frogs. As we continue on in Exodus 8:19, we come to a word that's found 4 times in the Bible. You know, after the first few plagues, which affected everyone in Egypt, including the Israelites, God says, "I'm going to put a division. So the plagues will only affect the Egyptians, and the rest of the Jewish people in Goshen, they're not going to be affected by the plagues." And that's what he says in verse 19, or verse 23 if you're reading in a Hebrew Bible. It says, "Thus I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall happen." That word for division is the word pedut. Pedut. Now this word occurs in this spelling, this form, 4 times. And what's interesting, this is the only place it's translated division. The other 3 places, let me read them to you, and you'll find these in your notes. The other 3 places are this: Psalm 111, verse 9. He sent redemption, pedut, to his people. Psalm 130, verse 7. "O Israel, hope in Adonai, for with Adonai there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful pedut," redemption. And then Isaiah 50, verse 2. He says, "Is my hand shortened that it cannot pedut," it cannot redeem? Now, when you read the Hebrew and you see this word by itself, the first thing will come to mind, oh, this is referring to redemption. But it's translated division. I guess the question is, should it be? Maybe it should be translated a redemption. Because there's going to be a stark difference between the people who belong to God and the people who don't. And it's almost as if he's saying, I'm redeeming these people from the consequences of the rest of these plagues. And because their experience going through the plagues is going to be so utterly different from the experience of everyone else, it's actually a kind of redemption. It's a kind of division. So it's interesting. I just want you to know what word lies behind that word that is translated division in our English Bibles. All right, continuing on. Exodus 9:24. Now in Exodus 9:24, we read this. Now this is plague number 7. There's a longer description of plague 7 than any of the other plagues. And I want you to take your time to really do a study of plague number 7. It's unique of all the plagues. And I've done teachings on this that you can find at the Beth Tikkun website. And plague 7 is utterly unique because God gives a prelude to this, and he says, "This time I will send all my plagues against Pharaoh, against Egypt." In other words, plague 7 somehow contains all 10. It represents all 10. 7 is always unique in a series. 7 is such a special number. But in plague number 7, it's the only place in Exodus where we find God using his name Yud-He Vav-He and his name Elohim. Yud-He Vav-He, when it's used, expresses his mercy, his long-suffering, his grace. But when you see Elohim, it's his name of strict justice, following the rules and doing things exactly right. No, it's just it's very precise, and it's a name he uses mostly for judgment. But he puts them together, Adonai Elohim. He puts them right there together. So we're going to see grace and mercy, but we're going to see strict justice as well. And it's the only place in Exodus where his two names are put together like that. This is the plague where Pharaoh repents and says, "I've sinned." You find the word land, haaretz, used 7 times in this plague. Now, there are a number of other things, but the most unique thing about this plague is the mixture of what you'd say fire and water, because you have hail coming out of the sky, which is ice, frozen water, but on the ground there was fire inside the ice. Whenever you find fire and water dwelling together, you have Adonai Elohim. You have God's presence showing up. And he's saying, this is a picture of all my plagues and what I'm doing. All right, enough of that. Let's get back to this. And so it describes this hail and says there was hail and fire flashing. In fire, it's va'esh and fire, mit lachachat. There's a mouthful. Mit lachachat. It's flashing inside the hail. Can you imagine seeing a chunk of ice? Imagine these as being massive hailstones. They did a lot of damage. And inside, you look inside the hailstone and there's lightning and fire flashing around inside. Very weird. Fire flashing continually in the midst of the hail, very heavy hail, such as had never been in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. This phrase, Eish mitlachakat, is used only 2 times in the entire Bible. Can you guess what the other place is? It's another very strange scene. It's in Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel's having this vision, and he sees God's chariot and the wheels within the wheels, and he sees the seraphim, and he sees these angelic beings, and oh my, it's quite a scene. But here early on, in verse 4, it says, "And I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing." Eish mitlachakat. Eish mitlachakat. Fire flashing forth continually. And in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. So in Exodus, we're looking at a block of ice, and inside of it we see the fire flashing. Here he sees the fire flashing. Inside the fire flashing, there's gleaming metal. He's going deeper. But the main thing is this. We have a hyperlink. We have God sending what he says, all my plagues, in plague number 7, this strange thing of ice falling out of the sky that has flashing fire inside. And then we have Ezekiel's vision of God's, I don't know even what word to use, his extraordinary appearance, this incredible vision of God's holy throne with the holy beings around him. Now you take those 2 pictures and put them side by side. Here's God showing up in Egypt to show the people of Egypt and Pharaoh in particular. These gods you worship, they're no gods. It reminds me, this is probably a little sacrilegious, but it reminds me of that scene in Crocodile Dundee when the kid comes up to mug him, and he pulls out this knife, and Dundee says, "That's no knife." And then he pulls out this thing about this long and says, "That's a knife." Well, that's what God's doing here. He says, those gods, those are no gods. This is what God looks like. And it gives him a little bit of a hint in these blocks of ice. But when you go to Ezekiel 1:4, you begin to realize who was in those blocks of ice, bringing destruction and repentance, though temporary, to Pharaoh's heart. It was Adonai, Elohim. Wow, what a scene. You know, it's not my purpose in these Parshah seasonings to unlock every one of these details and to follow it, each one to its end and to the glorious insights that are to be found there. Mostly just to make you aware of them so you can really begin to study on your own. So I've given you several here to look at, and I hope you'll pick up at least one of these and follow it to the end if there is one, and enjoy the journey. So I hope that the study in Vaera has been a blessing to you, and I look forward, I just love the book of Exodus, and I look forward to meeting with you again for the next Torah portion. And until then, shalom and may God bless.
That's all, folks.